Alright, this is the second in a series of recordings for the anatomy of the reproductive tract. And in this one we're going to be focusing on the entire anatomy of the male and female internal genitalia tract as well as the bladder. And we're going to start with the bladder. Alright, so here's a written description, but I'm going to go to the images so you can kind of follow along with both. Alright, so first thing, the bladder you can see in this image here highlighted, and what you can see is that the most important thing to think about first is that the parietal peritoneum of the abdomen is actually sweeping down over the abdominal wall, and then it's covering all the pelvic structures like a blanket before it sweeps up the posterior abdominal wall. So that's one of the important relationships for the superior part of the bladder, is that parietal peritoneum sweeping over top. Another important relationship for females is that most often the uterus is sitting on top of the urinary bladder, which you can see in the lower figure. Alright, the posterior part of the bladder, important relationships for males. The seminal vesicles are sitting right behind the bladder as well as the rectum. And then for females, the vagina is sitting immediately behind the posterior part of the bladder. And then we have the neck of the bladder, or the inferior part of the bladder. Most important thing there is the urethral orifice, or the opening of the urethra is sitting right there. For males, the prostate is sitting right underneath that, and you can see that the structure labeled by letter P. Alright, so those are the important relationships of the bladder. Looking inside the bladder, typically when you look at the bladder, it has this rough surface, and that is because of the presence of the detrusor muscles, which are the muscles that contract to squeeze the bladder. But there's one region called the trigone, which is very smooth. It doesn't have that rough appearance. And the reason why is because it doesn't have those detrusor muscles there. So you have this smooth appearance, and it's bordered by three important structures. Highlighted by the yellow are the openings of the ureters coming from above. Okay, so the right and left ureters are coming in, and then the inferior, highlighted by the red circle, is the opening of the urethra. So you get this triangular shape, or trigone. All right, and in the lab you'll be able to see that really clearly, at least on a couple of different sample structures or prosections. All right, so that's a brief overview of the bladder. All right, ureters. Talked a lot about it in the posterior abdominal wall, so you know the course in terms of going over the psoas muscle, traveling over the pelvic brim, which I'll show here, traveling over the psoas muscle, over the pelvic brim, highlighted by the green arrow, and then it dips down into the pelvis. In females, there's an important relationship of the ureter as it's going right by the bladder with the uterine artery. Okay, and the ureter actually passes underneath that uterine artery, and the way you can remember that is like water under the bridge. We often refer to urine as being like water, and so the uterine artery is like a bridge, and it's water under the bridge. Okay, and that's highlighted by the red circle, or pardon me, the yellow circle. All right, in males, there's a relationship of the ureter with the ductus deferens, or the vas deferens. Okay, so the ureter is highlighted by the yellow circle, and the vas deferens, which is carrying semen sperm from the testes through the inguinal canal over the bladder, ultimately toward the prostate gland. And so you can see the vas deferens highlighted by the orange circle. Okay? And so you can see there's a relationship there. The vas deferens is passing over top of the ureter as it's entering into the bladder. And the way that you can try to remember that is like semen on the water. Okay, I came up with that one myself, so I'm kind of proud of that one. All right, so that's the important relationship right at the junction with the bladder for males and females. All right, now the pelvic viscera, the internal genitalia specifically. We'll run through the female, and then we'll go through the male, starting with the vagina. Okay, the vagina runs superiorly from the cervix, highlighted by the red circle, and opens at the vestibule inferiorly, the vestibule of the vagina, which is highlighted by the blue circle. right? If this was a 1950s video, I'd say that the vagina receives the penis during sexual intercourse. Now you know. All right, so to keep you out of trouble, I will also mention that the vagina is responsible for delivering the watermelon-sized baby. So think about that. Important relationships anteriorly, we mentioned the bladder as well as the urethra, and that's highlighted in this image. And posteriorly, you can see that the rectum and the anal canal are related to the vagina. Another important relationship or component of the vagina is a structure called the vaginal fornix, from which we get the term fornication. Fornix is like a deep pit that runs entirely around the cervix, which is protruding into the vagina. So you can see all these different colored circles. It's a continuous pit that completely surrounds the cervix as the vagina surrounds the cervix. Alright, so what are these different... Now, and then the fornix itself can be divided into different components, and they have important relationships. So we have an anterior fornix indicated by the blue circle. We also have the posterior fornix, which is highlighted by the red circle, and that's just that posterior aspect of this deep pit that completely surrounds the cervix. All right, it has an important relationship with the rectouterine pouch, which is just that portion of the peritoneal cavity that is extending all the way down into the pelvis, immediately behind the cervix, and separating the cervix from the rectum. So you can see that rectouterine pouch there. Alright, so that's an important relationship. Laterally, the lateral part of the fornix, highlighted by the two green circles, is an important region because the uterine artery and the ureter are located right adjacent to the lateral fornix. So if we go to this image here, you can see the green circle. You have that lateral fornix of the vagina, and right beside it, highlighted by the red arrow, is the uterine artery, and then the blue arrow, the ureter. Okay, and that has important clinical and surgical significance. Alright, so that's the anatomy around the vagina. Uterus. Different parts of the uterus are highlighted by the different colors. In green, the fundus of the uterus. Then in red, the body of the uterus. And within the body of the uterus, you have the uterine cavity. The uterine horns is where the uterine tubes are entering the uterus itself. And those are highlighted by gray. And then finally, highlighted by the blue circles, is the cervix. The uterine cavity communicates with the cervix through the internal os. Okay? And then you have the cervical canal, which communicates with the vagina through the external os. All right? So those are the different components of the uterus. Relationships, again, the uterus is sitting typically over or superior to the bladder, although there are different orientations of the uterus, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. And then also you can see the cervix is immediately related to the posterior part of the bladder, and as well it's related to the rectum posteriorly. Just an important, first we'll talk about the uterine tubes, and then kind of a clinical core that relates to the uterine tubes. So the parts of the uterine tubes, number one, the fimbriae. The fimbriae are these finger-like projections that kind of sweep over the ovary, and you can see that in the figure on the right, figure 3.32. And they're just these finger-like projections that sweep over the ovary, and they are responsible for collecting the egg that's being released or ovulated from the ovary. Then you have the infundibulum, which is just that funnel-shaped region, wide funnel-shaped region of the uterine tube. And then you have the ampulla, which is this curved portion of the uterine tube. And this is where fertilization, if you recall from embryology, most commonly occurs. Then you have the isthmus, which is just the narrowing of the uterine tube just before it enters the uterus. And that's the final portion of the uterine tube called the uterine portion, which is right sort of inside of the wall of the uterus. So those are the different components. Clinically speaking, you can actually create a connection between the outside environment with the parietal peritoneum through these uterine tubes. So the course would be the vestibule of the vagina, which is the external environment, then the vaginal canal, through the external os, through the cervical canal, through the internal os, into the uterine cavity. And then from the uterine cavity you go through the uterine tube, and there's actually a connection there with the parietal peritoneum. And what happens, the clinical significance of this is that if you have an infection of the female genital tract, it can actually infect the parietal peritoneum. And then you can get peritonitis, which is a very significant infection of the parietal peritoneum, which can spread quite significantly, and people can get really, really sick. So it's an important anatomical relationship. All right, male internal genitalia. Simple creatures, not a lot to say. Vas deferens, first of all. Here's the just some of the written components, but I'm going to go to the figures on the next slide. Alright, so the vas deferens is the tube that's carrying sperm from the testes ultimately to the prostate and the urethra within the prostate gland. Alright, so starting with the testes, there's an important structure on the testes called the epididymis, and that is highlighted by the red arrow, and it's the storage site for sperm. Alright, so the sperm are growing in there and maturing in there. From there, that is where the vas deferens begins, which is highlighted by the blue arrow. The vas deferens then continues up superiorly through the spermatic cord. From the spermatic cord, it's then going to enter the inguinal canal. Again, follow the blue arrows. The inguinal canal, it's then going to enter into the pelvis just underneath that parietal peritoneum in the pelvis, and it's going to sweep over the superior part of the bladder, which is what you see here with a blue arrow, and then finally it's going to go around to the posterior part of the bladder with that relationship with the ureter, semen on the water, and then it's going to sweep behind the posterior part of the bladder. And I'll go to the next figure. Look at that blue arrow, and this is the posterior side of the bladder, and it's going to be immediately adjacent to the seminal vesicles, which is highlighted by the red circle. And seminal vesicles produce seminal fluid, and the vas deferens is going to enter into that or join with the seminal vesicles to form ejaculatory ducts. Okay? And that's where the vas deferens ends, where it becomes the ejaculatory ducts with the seminal vesicles. The seminal vesicles, and these ejaculatory ducts, are then going to enter into the prostate gland, which is highlighted by the blue circle. And from there, the ejaculatory ducts will join the urethra and then enter into the penis, which we'll talk about later. All right. So you can see the prostate gland is sitting immediately underneath the bladder, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more now. Alright, so the prostate gland, again, just below the bladder, it completely surrounds the urethra as it exits the bladder. Okay, and that's highlighted by that red bracket in the middle figure. So the urethra is completely surrounded by the prostate, and so that part of the urethra is called the prostatic urethra. Alright, the prostate, you can see the other ducts that are passing through the prostate are those ejaculatory ducts, which are highlighted by the yellow circles. If you look to the figure on the far left, you can see there's two yellow circles that are fairly far apart. Those are each of the two ejaculatory ducts coming from the right vas deferens and the left vas deferens. They're eventually going to merge, which is what you can see in the yellow circle on the right. And then they're going to merge, and then they're ultimately going to drain into the prostatic part of the urethra. Another important anatomical component of the prostate is this fibrous capsule that completely encapsulates the prostate gland, and it's called the dense fibrous capsule, the prostatic capsule. And what's important about that capsule is that it contains the prostatic nerve plexus, okay, which contains parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers that surround the prostate, and then ultimately the sympathetic fibers are going to continue on to the penis to support erection. Okay, so that's that prostatic nerve plexus. There's also a prostatic venous plexus, which also has important clinical significance. All right, so that's a little bit about the prostate. Finally, the prostate has a number of different regions or lobes or zones. And there's an anterior muscular zone, which is highlighted by the yellow region, which is the anterior aspect of the prostate. Then you have a transitional zone, which is that part of the prostate that immediately surrounds the urethra. And then you have the central zone, which is highlighted in blue, which is just that region of the prostate in between the two ejaculatory ducts. And then finally you have the peripheral zone, which is this or pink zone, the largest zone of the prostate. All right, and certain regions or certain zones have important clinical implications, which is why it's important to know about them. All right, so male internal genitalia, female internal genitalia, as well as the bladder. That's what we covered in this recording.